Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we are going to be diving into the Eldar Falcon, one of the quintessential competitive Eldar grab tanks. Now, by now in 10th edition, most of you guys have a good idea of what the Falcon does, and many of you have written it into your lists. I myself run the Falcon quite frequently. There's rarely a game where I don't run at least one of them, and in many of my lists, I run 2 or 3. They are absolutely awesome, but what makes them so good? I would actually put forward that they are one of the best grab tanks in the entire index, and in my opinion, they are the best. I think the Falcon, by far, for the points, is the best grab tank in the entire book. And it really doesn't just come down to the stats or the raw firepower that this thing can put out, but rather the combos and synergies that it can play a part in any successful Eldar list. So without further ado, let us go ahead and dive into the video proper. We're going to be looking at the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Falcon, its strengths and weaknesses, combos and synergies. We're going to be talking about positioning your Falcon for max damage in your games with some examples and different terrain layouts for you guys. And we're going to be looking at the role the Falcon plays in Eldar armies and how to make the most out of it. So starting at its stat line, we have a movement of 14, which is pretty fast. However, its durability is very low. Toughness 9 and a 3-up save with only 12 wounds means this thing goes down pretty quickly once it's targeted. It does have an OC of 3, however, so it's a little bit better at sneaking onto objectives and perhaps even capturing them. Starting with the weapons that it can take, we're going to go briefly through this because I know a lot of you guys already know what these weapons do, but it can take an Eldar missile launcher, and that basically has the option of dealing some, anti-large damage or anti-infantry. Neither of them are standout, but it does have a dual profile, which means, both profiles are a little less effective than the other options, but, you do have that versatility. The Bright Lance is a great anti-large weapon and the most common pick for the Falcon, and it goes really great with the Pulse Laser. Speaking of, the Pulse Laser is a fantastic weapon with 3 shots, making it excellent at killing Terminators, and it's a pretty good tool against large targets as well, things like transports and stuff like that find themselves at toughness 9 or less. It has decent damage at D6, and AP-2 means that you're going to be reducing at least some armor, even if the target's in cover. You have the Scatter Laser, which is an option. It's good against light infantry, but not against much else, meaning it's probably going to be left at home as the current meta revolves around heavy infantry or large targets. It has decent damage at D6, and AP-2 means that you're going to be reducing at least some armor, even if the target's in cover. You have the Scatter Laser, which is an option. It's good against light infantry, but not against much else, meaning it's probably going to be left at home as the current meta revolves around heavy infantry or large targets. You do also have a Shuriken Cannon underslung, and you can take a Shuriken Cannon on top on the turret. Typically, though, it's only taken underslung to upgrade the Shuriken Catapult. Alternatively, you can take the Shuriken Catapult for better secondary scoring, allowing you to advance and still score on secondaries. And the Star Cannon is the better weapon against MEQ without invul saves or light bikes and specialized units. The Star Cannon's in kind of an odd spot. I think it's one of the weapons that is good into certain profiles, but struggles against most other profiles in the game. So very specialized weapon, and you might not see it that much in competitive play due to that, unless your meta is very specific. As far as its melee weapon goes, it does have the Wraithbone Hull, which is standard for all Eldar vehicles. It gives you 6 dice on a tank shock, which is an average of 2 mortal wounds. If the strength is higher than the, obviously target strength, you're going to get plus 2 dice to that. So an average of 2 to 3 mortal wounds on tank shock. As far as its abilities go, it does have the Deep Strike ability, which is situationally useful, but not something I recommend often. A lot of people, when they look at this thing, automatically say, well, it has Deep Strike, which makes it super good. But in most cases, it's not great because a good opponent can screen that out very well. It has a large hull, has a large footprint, and if you're taking infantry in it and they want to disembark, it's kind of an even bigger footprint. Because remember, they have to disembark outside of 9 inches as well, and that can put them out of range of Melta and different things like that. So, I think it's useful to have in some situations, but definitely not something you want to do every game. As far as its ability goes, it has one of the best transport abilities in the entire game, in my honest opinion. Has fire support, which allows units to disembark to reroll wounds against a target the Falcon hits. So the target, is hit once by one of the weapons on the Falcon, and the units that disembark from it, all the units that disembark from it, get to reroll wounds against that target. And also keep in mind that this is in the shooting phase and the assault phase, so if you do shoot a unit and then end up charging in with it as well, they will still get those wound rerolls. As far as its transport ability goes, it can transport 6 models, which is perfect for a small unit of aspect warriors or characters, and there are several characters that really benefit from this unit's ability. It can get damaged at 4 wounds or less, which give it a -1 to hit, but again, this is a fragile tank. It's probably not going to survive these kind of encounters very often. So if an enemy can draw a line of sight to it and shoot it or assault it, it's probably going to be dead quickly. As far as its wargear options, it can take 1 weapon from the heavy weapons list in addition to its pulse laser, a missile launcher, a bright lance, a shuriken cannon, or a star cannon. You're pretty much always going to take the bright lance on this guy, and you can take a shuriken cannon instead of the catapult. Now, as far as that goes, a lot of people will say that they enjoy the catapult because of the secondary objective scoring, but in my view, just the way I build lists, and the specific role that the Falcon plays on the battlefield, I would try to get as much damage as possible out of this thing, and I would indeed give it a shuriken cannon. As for its cost, it only costs 140 points, which is an absolute bargain for the solid weapons and abilities. This has never been nerfed since the beginning of 10th edition. So when everybody was complaining about how cheap and effective Eldar units were in the very beginning of the edition, and how OP, the fire prisms were and stuff like that, the Falcon has not been nerfed a single time. And arguably, it was still a solid option competitively, and I think it would have seen much more play if we didn't have that little Wraith Knight problem that was kind of plaguing competitive play in the beginning of the edition. As far as its keywords go, it does have the fly keyword, making movement a little bit awkward at times, but a little bit less awkward than the Wave Serpent or the Fire Prism because it does have a slightly smaller profile, not having to worry about that, huge prism cannon or the fins on the end of the Wave Serpents. Alright, so what are the strengths and weaknesses of the Falcon? So its strengths are it is fast and it hits hard for the points. It's only 140 points. Think about that. That's only 30 more points than a Warwalker. It comes with a pulse laser, a bright lance, and a shuriken cannon, so arguably it has better firepower, and of course it can transport models within it. And on top of that, it passes out wound rerolls to units that are disembarking from it, which is huge. It's also very disruptive to enemy units. After dropping off their cargo, it can go and charge in, it can tank shock, and it can block up a large area because of its large hull, something the Warwalker cannot do. Its weaknesses, however, are that it is fragile and it can be tough to position effectively. Again, it is a larger kind of tank, so that can make it a little bit harder to hide and stage and position correctly when you're thinking about taking a Falcon over something like a Star Weaver, or if you play Drukhari, something like a Venom. As far as its combos and synergies, I think this is where the Falcon truly shines and just makes it a fantastic inclusion in every single Eldar army. It passes out wound rerolls, which are fantastic with several ranged units, including Fire Dragons and Dark Reapers. Units with devastating wounds are especially hard-hitting the turn they disembark, so things like Striking Scorpions, the Death Jester, Kahandras, etc. Even Quins with the Troop Master are really good in this thing. Solo characters and Phoenix Lords are very good out of this thing as well. Fuegan, for example, can hit really hard in combat with wound rerolls. He has Strength 5, which is good, Damage 3, but, against Terminator equivalents, he is wounding on 4s. He does need that little bit of extra help to deal that extra damage. The Solitaire is very good as well. His Strength 6 weapons are good, but against tougher targets, it might be a little bit, difficult for him to find that much value. So being able to reroll wounds is very good. The Falcon also has great stratagem synergy with the units inside. Most of them have the grenades keyword, so things like Fire Dragons, Harlequins, and stuff like that. It can also tank shock itself, dealing even more mortal wound damage. So on average, these two stratagems, when used together, can deal about 5 to 6 mortal wounds, which is really strong. And, basically being able to half-shot an enemy vehicle or, take out a lighter enemy vehicle with just stratagems alone is really strong, allowing you to concentrate on other targets. Okay, so now that we've kind of talked about the strengths and weaknesses and of course the combos and synergies of the Falcon, let's go ahead and talk about how to position your Falcons for max damage, because one of the main issues with the Falcon, one of its weaknesses, is it is hard to position and it is hard to get the most out of. And I would actually go so far as to say it is one of the harder units to use in the Eldar Index, just because of the fact the positioning is key and it is a very fragile model. So if it's caught out of position at any time before it disembarks, you are going to lose the Falcon and you are going to lose its occupants very quickly. Alright, so for today's video, we are going to be using terrain layout number 3, and we are going to be using the deployment sweeping advance. Thank you to the subscriber who pointed that out in the last video I made. So this is sweeping advance, the diagonal deployment, long ways. And this terrain layout is a little bit different than terrain layout number 1. You have less line of sight on the edges of the battlefield, and you have more lanes of line of sight, arguably in the center of the battlefield instead. Not in the direct center, but kind of off to the left and the right. So the first thing I want to show you guys is how important target priority is when using a Falcon with, anything inside. So in this example, we do have 5 fire dragons in there, but we also have Fuegan. A lot of players have come up to me and said they're a little bit intimidated about using this combination because they don't know how to position it correctly. And oftentimes what happens is the Falcon is either destroyed before it can get into the fray, or it just has trouble moving into a correct position. So it really ends up not having a lot of impact on the battlefield. So in this particular deployment, you always want to make sure that you are completely out of line of sight behind that obscuring terrain before the enemy turn. This will force your opponent to try to move units forward onto objectives. They basically have to unless they want to just give up primary points. But they're often not going to use their most valuable units to do this, right? They're not going to put their most expensive unit of Terminators out there in the open for you to just kill. However, because of the low price tag of 85 points on Fire Dragons, it means they are happy to shoot at transports. So in this example, we move the Falcon from that L-shaped ruin on the left-hand side of the battlefield. We move that Falcon forward, but before we do so, we drop off Fuegan. This is extremely important because if we don't drop off Fuegan beforehand, we're not going to be able to assault with him. Now, he does have movement 7 and also a pretty good charge distance, especially if you have a Fate dice in your back pocket. So you can pretty much easily, disembark 3 inches, move him 7 inches, and then charge in safely into the unit that the impulsor drops off. And trust me, that impulsor is not long for this world. So this is something you'll actually very commonly see Space Marine players do. They'll have like a unit of Eliminators in there or something. Those are the, elite snipers of the Space Marines. And the Space Marine snipers can actually disembark from the transport. They can shoot. They can kind of use their movement to come back into the transport. And then the transport shoots using their weapons. So they actually shoot twice, which is a little bit nonsense in my opinion. But as the rules are written, they can definitely do it because the Impulsor has the firing deck special rule and the Eliminators have the ability to make a normal move of 6 inches after they shoot. So, again, rules as written, they can do it. So expect to see this in your games against Space Marines. Now, what I've often seen as well is Space Marine players placing their Impulsor right next to a ruined wall so that if it's destroyed, the Eliminators can basically disembark right on the other side of the ruin wall and, be safe from enemy shooting because they're going to be out of line of sight. And this is essentially where Fuegan comes in because he's going to actually just charge into them and kill them in combat. So what do we do from here, right? Well, the Fire Dragons are going to open up on the Impulsor, but there's a couple things we can do here. Now, if we trust our rolls and we don't think we're going to whiff, we can just shoot the Fire Dragons first and basically kill the transport right off the bat. This shouldn't be too hard to achieve because Fire Dragons are very good at killing vehicles like this, but there are times where your opponent might, pop a command point to use smoke or to use Armor of Contempt or something like that to try to keep it alive. So I would suggest that if you think you're not going to roll average, that you shoot the Falcon first for those full wound rerolls. This will mean that the Falcon isn't going to be, able to really shoot at the squad that disembarks from the Impulsor, but it guarantees at least that the Impulsor is going to be destroyed. So either the Falcon can make sure that the Fire Dragons kill their target effectively, or, if you're really lucky and your Falcon just outright kills the Impulsor, your Fire Dragons can shoot at whatever gets out. Either way, your fire dragons are going to be trading up against that target. Even if they're shooting at eliminators that have just gotten out, or, a unit of space marines, whatever it is, they're going to be able to do some significant damage. Now, you'll also notice that I positioned the fire dragons just outside of that ruin in the center of the battlefield, just to the right of the Falcon. I did this on purpose. That's because if the Falcon actually does kill the Impulsor by itself, the fire dragons can always shoot at something else, right? The fire dragon Exarch has a fire pike, which has a range 18. You might not be in melter range of something, but you can definitely get some shots off and still have value for that unit, regardless of what happens with the dice. Of course, unless you just roll all ones, in which case that would suck and, nothing is getting value at all. But in most cases, you're going to be at least able to get value with both the Falcon and the Fire Dragons in this way. Now, the important part about this is that the Falcon is now protected because it's on the other side of the ruins to the left. You can either fire and fade the Falcon back if you want to, or you can follow up with a tank shock if your opponent kind of positions their models in a certain way. Perhaps your opponent, doesn't go onto the other side of the ruin wall, but tries to block you from getting onto the objective with a fire and fade. This is something your opponent might also do. In this case, you can easily tank shock with a Falcon and run that unit over. Either way, though, that unit is probably going to die. You're putting your opponent into a position where they can't really do a whole lot to stop you from taking the objective. And again, just keep in mind that Fuegan is going to charge that unit of eliminators or whatever, kind of space marines are in there. They can't overwatch because they are battle shocked from being, having gotten out of a destroyed transport. So Fuegan is going to have an absolute field day on that unit that just got out. And the best part about this whole thing is that you have a revivable character in Fuegan that is probably now out of line of sight behind a ruined wall, holding an objective that your opponent now has to take back. And again, your opponent is going to have to deal with Fuegan, is going to have to deal with the Fire Dragons, and also have to deal with the Falcon that is partially out of line of sight. And you may actually have fire and faded it back into, your backfield. So in other words, you're really only giving up the Fire Dragons. You're only leaving 85 points worth of Fire Dragons out to dry. Everything else is relatively safe, or, for your opponent to get those models like Fuegan, they're going to have to commit a serious amount of units. Okay, so let's look at another scenario where we actually have a full-on melee assault. Now, a lot of people have had trouble fighting things like Catan shards and other tough targets on objectives. The Falcon is actually really good at breaking these things, and a lot of Necron players, if you are playing against Necrons and they are using a Catan, they will overestimate their Catans quite often. It is absolutely no secret that the Catans are extremely durable for their cost, having half damage, 4+ invul saves, and feel no pain. On top of that, they can resurrect wounds because, of course, they are Necrons. Which basically means that if you're not able to kill it in one turn, you're probably not going to be able to kill it for several after that because of all the kind of regeneration abilities that your opponent's army is going to have. So, what do we do in this scenario? Well, if we have a Falcon waiting in our backfield, knowing that the Catan shard is going to walk up on a primary objective and going to try to hold it down, we are simply going to do a couple of things. First of all, a unit of Harlequins is going to disembark from the Falcon before it moves and move up as close as possible to the Catan using the grenade stratagem and also shooting with its fusion pistols and other, shuriken pistols and stuff like that. And while this is not going to be able to exactly kill the Catan on its own, remember that the Falcon has supporting fire. It has fire support. So that means the Falcon is going to shoot first. It's going to give the buff to the Harlequins to reroll their wound rolls, and then the Quins are going to be able to, more successfully get some wounds on the Catan. Each fusion pistol is doing D3 plus 2. You probably will be within 3 inches at that point because, they have movement 8. They're very fast. And if you start from that position over there on the bottom center of your own battlefield, your own deployment zone, you should be within 3 inches with at least a couple models. So after that happens, you're shooting the Catan with a pulse laser, a bright lance, a shuriken cannon, 3 fusion pistols, because I believe you have one on the troop master as well, and, 2 in the troop itself. You're also using the grenade stratagem, which will deal 3 mortal wounds, which will put 2 wounds through on the Catan as well, because it does have Feel No Pain 5+. Afterward, what you can do is go ahead and charge in. Now, what you do is very, very important here, the order in which you actually fight. You want to make sure you fight with the Harlequins first. The Harlequins are going to fight. They're going to get full rerolls to wound, as well as a, normal single reroll to hit because of the Eldar Battle Host ability, the detachment bonus. This will on average rolls produce about 7 to 8 wounds. Most of those are going to be mortal wounds, which your opponent is only going to get a 5+ Feel No Pain against. You're also probably going to manage a couple of more wounds just because of the fact that Harlequins get +1 to wound on charge. So instead of wounding on 6s, you're wounding on 5s, which means you'll probably get a couple here and there. Maybe your opponent will fail one and you'll do an additional damage here or there with your Quins. Now, of course, the Falcon is also going to tank shock. So tank shock is not going to get the additional dice, but that's 2 extra mortal wounds that your opponent has to make. Probably, at the worst, maybe your opponent fails one of those, takes an additional mortal. But, the reason why you fight with the Quins first is because remember your opponent can interrupt. So there's a stratagem in the core rulebook. A lot of you guys probably know about it. It doesn't come up often, but in situations like this, if you fight with the Falcon first, your opponent is going to pop that stratagem and your Harlequins will die because Catan shards are very good in combat. So definitely don't do that. The whole purpose of the tank shock is so that you can get a few extra mortal wounds in, not for the damage that the Falcon is going to do in combat. So if your opponent does interrupt after your Quins attack and decides to kill the Falcon, that's great. The Falcon's going to die, of course, but your Quins are going to survive. And after you consolidate and base your opponent, you're probably going to have more CP on that objective as well. And after you consolidate, you should have more OC on that objective than your opponent, if you don't manage to kill the Catan shard. And again, with all the mortal wounds you're doing and devastating wounds, you should be able to kill that shard, even if you need another unit like a Warwalker or something like that to come up and support. And guys, I know it seems like a lot of resources to throw, but you'd be happy to know that most Catan shards are about the same cost as a Falcon carrying a unit of Quins with a Troop Master. They're around 270 points, right? The Quins with a Troop Master and a Falcon is 270 on the dot, and a Catan shard can range from, I think, 260 to 290, about that. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But I know that they are around that cost. So, that combination actually trades pretty evenly. And on top of that, yeah, you do have to use 2 command points, but that's what command points are there for. So now this kill is going to put your opponent in an awkward position. They may have felt secure in the fact that all you had to deal with the Catan shard was a single Falcon and a squad of Quins. But now that the Catan shard is dead, you're on the objective, you're controlling that objective, they may not have the resources to effectively deal with it. And that's essentially what a Falcon is at the end of the day, right? It's a scalpel. It's meant to, carve out a piece of your opponent's army very quickly and leave them with less to deal with your own units. Now, I didn't include a diagram of this, but I want to walk you through something you guys might want to try out as well. It doesn't have a high impact on the battle, but it's one of those things that you can sneak in the beginning of the game to get a little bit of extra damage with your Dark Reapers. And that is the old Falcon switcheroo. So what you do with the Falcon switcheroo is you essentially start with a unit of Dark Reapers inside the Falcon, and then you start with a unit of, Fire Dragons or whatever else you're going to have in the Falcon afterwards on the table, right beside it. On the first turn, you're going to disembark the Dark Reapers and then move the Falcon into a position where it can fire on a target, maybe a scouting unit or a unit that your opponent kind of left out there as chaff. You can shoot at that unit with the Falcon, and then you can finish it off with the Dark Reaper Exarch's Tempest Launcher because it has indirect fire. And of course, before the Falcon moves, you're going to want to put the Fire Dragons back in it. Now, this is a totally legal maneuver. You're going to actually be able to also get rerolls to wounds on that Tempest Launcher, which makes it more reliable. And because we're coming into, having a new Orc Codex, we're coming into having a new Tau Codex, there's going to be units that are going to be deploying forward. I'm sure we're going to see more Kroot, commandos, things like that are going to be using scout moves or infiltrate to grab objectives early and prevent movement. So having something like a Tempest Launcher in your backfield that can get rerolls to wounds against those types of units is really powerful. Maybe not so much against Toughness 5 Orc Commandos, but especially against Kroot and Kroot Hounds, they are going to be dying in droves to that Dark Reaper Tempest Launcher. So if you can, on the first turn, guarantee destroy a unit of Kroot Hounds or severely damage a unit of Kroot, warriors or whatever, then your opponent is going to be in a fix right at the start of the battle, and your Dark Reapers are already going to be generating some massive value for you. Okay, so what is the role of the Falcon in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of it? So the Falcon is a damage multiplier that has a high damage output itself, and after dropping off its cargo, it's a decent disruption piece with a long hull for blocking movement afterwards. And always keep in mind, you have Fire and Fade at your disposal, so you can move it another 14 inches if you have to. If you need to score on something like behind enemy lines, you can definitely do that in a pinch. However, the Falcon's success relies upon good positioning and effective targeting to be able to max out its potential. It is very hard to use, but it's extremely rewarding when you get both the positioning and the targeting down correctly. So in conclusion, the Falcon is an absolute workhorse that massively increases the potential of its cargo and packs quite a punch itself, and I really like the Falcon. I've always liked how it looks on the battlefield. It's a really old model, guys, but it still looks good. I mean, you don't hear many Eldar players complaining about the Falcon. You hear us complaining about Warp Spiders, about Swooping Hawks and their sculpts, but you rarely hear people complain about the Falcon, and I think that's just because it has a classic and sleek design that all of us have fallen in love with over the years. Also, it's a really easy tank to put together. Thank goodness. I mean, by now I can probably put it together by memory alone. And I can't say that for all of the new Eldar kits. The new Eldar kits are a little bit confusing, and you really do need the directions for them. So that's a big plus to the Falcon as well, is that you can typically find these secondhand or cheaper than other models because of their old design, but they still look good. I actually hope, between you and me, and to the Eldar community, I hope they don't actually redo the Falcon for a while. I mean, they may eventually do it anyway, along with all the other Eldar tanks, but I hope they save it to last, because I swear, the Falcon is so cool, and I just absolutely love its look and its simplicity as well. Alright everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching. I know there's a couple of units that I didn't mention in the Falcon, but they are still good. And those units being, the Warlock Conclave or maybe even Corsairs are pretty good out of a Falcon as well. Maybe a little bit too expensive for what they do, but I think with wound rerolls that can easily be made up for. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. What combinations out of Falcon do you guys like? And how do you guys like to use your Falcons in game? Alright everybody, once again, thank you so much for watching the video, and thank you so much to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last year and a half. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to become a channel supporter and patron, I have free trials activated, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategies, tactics, and of course hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to come and check out some Eldar-inspired apparel at my channel store page to rep your local game store, or you want to check out some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, I will leave the links for those in the description as well. Alright everybody, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one everybody. Peace out.